All right, so we're about to jump in. So first and foremost, I want to welcome everyone to Brave Spaces 2021, Rochester's second annual summit to end hate for the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. This session is teaching history through an anti-racist lens in Monroe County. So what I'll ask of everyone, just as a little housekeeping, if we can avoid unmuting our mics, and if we have any questions, comments, or whatever the case, putting them in the chat. The chat is open. And yes, so my name is Thomas Vincent Cuyler Jr. I am the Youth Engagement Coordinator for the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester, and I will be serving as your moderator for today's session. So again, I want to thank you all for joining. For those of you who participated in Juju Chang's keynote address, I hope you all enjoyed that that amazing keynote speaker that we were able to have today. So without further ado, let's get into our session. Last May, after the killing of George Floyd in police custody sparked a nationwide protest for social justice, East High School Superintendent Dr. Shaun Nelms challenged his colleagues across Monroe County to teach students about Rochester's history of segregation and disparity. Representatives from each of the county school districts joined with the University of Rochester Center for Urban Education to create a more inclusive history curriculum for 8th, 11th, and 12th graders. Piloted in spring of 2021, the effort is being rolled out across every Monroe County district this year. Students will explore topics such as housing policies and practices, school funding and segregation, and more within the context of local history from Rochester's 1964 uprising to the present day. It is my pleasure to introduce East High School Superintendent Dr. Shaun Nelms, Brighton Central School District Superintendent Dr. Kevin McGowan, and East Irondequoit Central School District Superintendent Mary Groh for a moderated discussion for this new curriculum. I'll be prompting our panelists with a series of questions. We may have a few minutes for your questions, so please post them in the Q&A. So that being said, I want to take the opportunity to allow each superintendent to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about them. So if we want to start with Dr. Shaun Nelms.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction. Again, I'm Dr. Shaun Nelms, Superintendent for the East High Project. This is a project that is coordinated with the University of Rochester, the New York State Education Department, and the Board of Education for the Rochester City School District. I also serve as the director for the Center for Urban Education Success at the University of Rochester's Warner School of Education and Human Development. So it's a pleasure to be here to have this important discussion along with two of my incredible colleagues. And so I'll tag in Kevin, who's next, I believe.
Thanks very much, Shaun. Kevin McGowan, I'm the superintendent in the Brighton Central School District, beginning my 13th year here in this community, also as a parent, a dad here, and a colleague of Shaun and Mary's. Very proud to have been part of this conversation specifically, but also the work of the Levine Center, sitting on the steering committee. I'm very glad to be here today. Thanks, Thomas, for moderating this, and Mary and Shaun for joining us as well. And I think I should tag in Mary Groh now, my colleague from East Irondequoit.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Groh. I'm the superintendent of East Irondequoit Central School District. This is my 20th year in East Irondequoit, just about finishing up my 3rd year as superintendent. But as I've said lately, it feels like dog years. So we'll go for what feels like a lot longer than 3 years as superintendent. I'm very excited to be here today and to have this discussion with everybody. East Irondequoit, as I'll share a little later, is a very diverse school community. It's a little different from some of our other suburban school district neighbors. We're really proud of our diversity and really happy to be part of the conversation. As much as we're learning, there's always a great deal more to learn, and who better than to learn from colleagues and folks around the country or around the county today. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you for those introductions. So without further ado, let's jump into the questions. So this question is directed to Dr. Nelms. Dr. Nelms, please describe what led to the creation of the Monroe County anti-racism curriculum and why it is so important.
Thanks, yeah. I think it's important to note that the county school system had been focused on a project called Rock the Change, which is an effort to bring students together to discuss issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. And this effort started well before the latest issues related to social justice and reform. So as a county, we had already acknowledged that having student voice be at the center of our decisions was critical, and to hear from them and to allow them to leave high school prepared to enter college, career, or work with a mindset focused on inclusivity was important. Fast forward a few years since that project began and that engagement, which involved students throughout the entire county, we had a rash of incidents that were made public, not starting with, but most heightened with George Floyd and then Daniel Prude here in Rochester. And what became critically important to the superintendents is to reset how we collectively address issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in ways that's coordinated and also in ways that guarantee that any child leaving our school system in the county has a similar construct moving forward. Prior to this, I would say that we functioned as separate school districts, and the only time we truly coordinated was probably around athletic events. And so this gave us an opportunity to really reset who we are as leaders and the type of environment that we wanted to create for the county. So on June 9th, 2020, every superintendent from the component districts around this county signed a pledge. And the pledge was to assess our policies and practices to ensure high quality education, and also looking at our hiring practices and providing access to high quality instruction. We wanted to accelerate our professional development to ensure that our curriculum and what our kids are learning is reflective of America as a whole, not just our homogenous settings that we live and play in. That we wanted to focus on participating in a regional equity network, and that was a network of schools where we had teachers and administrators come together to discuss issues and challenges, but also develop solutions that would be consistently applied across the county. Superintendents also agreed to partner with BOCES and the University of Rochester Center for Urban Education Success to develop COMET units of study. And today we're going to talk about those units. We also wanted to make sure that our students, again, were at the center of our decisions. And last but certainly not least, we wanted to expand our opportunities for students to engage meaningfully with one another outside the school day. And so the units that we're going to discuss today, and I'm going to explain later on, I believe, is just an opportunity for our kids to not be indoctrinated in a single path of inquiry or a single way of thinking, but to give them opportunities to engage meaningfully and for teachers to facilitate the conversation in ways that give varying and differing perspectives on complex issues, so that when students leave high school, actually in high school, and they go off to college, work, or play, that they're better listeners than they are speakers. They're better able to engage in conversations that are meaningful. And more importantly, they have the skills to dissent in real time. Often we have students who will hear things, and we as adults too, weeks later, we say, I should have said this, or I should have said that. I think challenging issues around diversity, equity, inclusion in the moment is not only a meaningful thing, and it's a heroic thing, and a courageous thing, but it also impacts the bystanders, to let them know that they're seen and that they're heard, and that others are acknowledging these inequities also. So that is those are the units, and I will continue to talk about that later on within this presentation. But also I'll share some slides later on and what those units actually look like, so that as the community, we can have a better sense of how to support the schools as we transition towards these units that are anti-racist, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you for that explanation. Dr. McGowan, please describe the Brighton Central School District's involvement in the process and/or any particulars about the district as they relate to the new curriculum.
Sure, will do. Thank you, Thomas, and thanks, Shaun, for laying that out and explaining the background to that. I think you bring up some interesting themes that I hope are on in the back of people's minds. First of all, that the three of us, Shaun, Mary, and I, are really representative of 20 superintendents who said this is important work, we need to do this now. And our ability to positively impact social change is in the area of teaching and learning. Our policies and practices, yes, as organizations, have a significant impact on trends throughout the area and racial issues throughout the area, but that through teaching and learning, we can really have the biggest impact on children and their lives. And so this project was so important to that work. Specifically in Brighton, our social studies department leader, Adam Hiller, worked on this project, and his kids did the particular inquiry. Very specifically, I know we'll get into some details later, the question for the 11th grade inquiry for this particular unit, the overriding question was, what explains the segregation that exists in the Rochester area? And the supporting questions were, what stories do the statistics tell about the Rochester region? How has redlining impacted the Rochester region? And how have restrictive covenants affected housing in the Rochester region? What's really fascinating about this from the Brighton perspective is our kids were doing this while there was an effort underway in our community to have the race covenants removed from deeds in one particular neighborhood. And so the neighborhood had an organizing drive to bring people together to say, we should no longer have the covenants in deeds, and what do we need to do about that? And these things were happening really simultaneously, making this a very meaningful project for our kids. They were seeing it happen in their neighborhood, this really rich conversation, very positive feedback from our kids. They learned a great deal about redlining and the restrictive covenants. And then they had a choice in how they presented their final argument. Again, the student feedback was very, very positive. Then our social studies team worked together to unpack the inquiry and then plan a rollout for all students in 11th grade in this school year. So the connections to what was happening in their very own community and getting a better understanding of why segregation exists in Rochester were exceptionally powerful, and hopefully help move the needle for our kids in understanding the impact that that's having on the world today. Thanks.
Absolutely, no, thank you. Superintendent Gross, same question. Please describe the East Arundecoit Central School District's involvement in the process and/or any particulars about the district as they relate to the new curriculum.
Thank you, Thomas. Absolutely. I think what was important for East Arundecoit, and I think what's important as I begin this conversation is, as I said in my intro, East Arundecoit is very different from a lot of our suburban neighbors. Our makeup is we have 26 different languages spoken here in East Arundecoit. We have, again, a huge diversity here. We're about 45% white, about 25% Latinx, 21% African-American, and we have 64% of our families considered economically disadvantaged. So again, I say that to really help understand the community that is East Arundecoit Central School District. And as I had said, we take a great deal of pride in our diversity. So a lot of the work that we participated in with the University of Rochester in doing this work was some of the build upon the foundation we already started. And I say that because in about 2009, we became an IB school. And part of that commitment to be an international baccalaureate school was to also put text and commitment to put text in front of students that really reflected our student body, a more international mindedness. So that really was the catalyst to begin the change. Around the same time, we did a lot of work with our staff to create culturally responsive teaching and learning environments and help our staff to understand what that means, what it looks like in the classroom. How do we share that information with our students and families? So a lot of the foundation was there. When we worked with the University of Rochester to create these units, it just made perfect sense. As Kevin referenced the 11th grade unit, one of the units we piloted last spring was the 8th grade unit. And the whole idea of that unit was that words matter. And that has been so important in all that the work that we have done and as we create cultural responsive curriculum across all subject areas. So it just was a no-brainer for us. Again, we feel it's a responsibility of ours to put text and to put resources in front of students that reflect our student body. And again, that means that there's a richness, a diversity in all that we put in front of our students. And partnering with U of R to do this work just made perfect sense. It just enhanced to that work that was already beginning, and an opportunity to collaborate with a lot of people around the county to make it much more rich for our families and for our students. Thank you, Thomas.
Definitely. Thank you for that contribution. Dr. Nelms, please share some detail of the curriculum and how it's being rolled out.
All right, I'll do a screen share and share some of this. And what's really important is that this is one of the first times that the county collectively addressed an issue with such importance. And this is an effort to change, as Kevin said, the curriculum. We control teaching and learning. And I always say that the curriculum is our moral contract with our community. It is a document that we use, and it illustrates what we teach, why we teach it, how we teach it, and the importance of it. So if your curriculum does not reflect a focus towards inclusivity, diversity, and equity, then you have to really think about, what values does your community actually have and what they want to emphasize. So I'm going to walk through some of the structure. This is from an update from the superintendents back in January of 2021. And I'm going to walk through kind of slowly because I think it's important for the listeners to have context. And so as they form their questions, I encourage you to put those in the chat or in the Q&A so Mary, Kevin, and I can address them, that you understand the context and front behind this. First, I want to thank the planning team. This is a group of individuals from all over the county, Charles and East Irondequoit with Mary. Greg is in Webster. Mary Jo Pearson, Dr. Pearson is in the BOCES and leads their teaching and learning efforts. Tyann Wilson, who was at East, is now in the Fairport school system. She started less than a month ago. And then myself, who's at East. And that group expanded. That's the original planning team. Then each superintendent chose to send 1 to 5 individuals and teachers from their buildings to come create the curriculum itself, and these mini lessons or these inquiries. And we call them inquiries because it's really designed for people to think more critically about the work and to use the content to frame the context. The content in this case is the 1964 uprisings in Rochester, an event that many people who are new here, and even those who lived here, have no idea about. And the question is, what led to the 1964 uprising? What has actually happened and changed, or not changed at all, between 1964 and the incident, including involving Daniel Prude? And how do we move forward? And so that's kind of the content that we use to frame our discussion. But the context of those discussions can be applied to anything in life. In fact, the New York State Education Department created a pilot for the seal of civic readiness. Even at the state level, they understand that students must leave high school with a civic-minded attitude and construct. And so what we're doing is not something outside of the curriculum. People have said that, some critics of this. This is part of what the state is demanding of school districts to do moving forward to ensure that our students are able to compete, not just domestically, but internationally as well. The seal of civic readiness is part of the overall curricular goals of the state. It has 6 points that we want that they emphasize for students to be able to know and be able to do. The civic readiness seal ends in a capstone project. These units arguably could be part of that capstone project where you're looking at a civic issue within their school, their community. You're analyzing that context, and then you're also taking action. And part of our units end with students taking action. So we took the framework from the state, created units that were focused on local history, and we ran them through a number of questions. This is the alignment to the state standards. Again, we didn't pull things out of the air. We were very targeted and aligned with what the state is heading and also the national standards. And here are some examples of some of the inquiries. You'll see at grades 8, there are 2, and at grade 11, there are 2. And the expectation is that all students will leave throughout the county, ending in 8th grade, exploring one or both of these topics, and then the same thing in 11th grade. So you take a student who's in 8th grade this year, in the next 3 years of their lives, they would have experienced all 4 of these units. If you look at the third column, it gives you an idea of some of the compelling questions that we'll be asking. And the far right are some of the individuals who write these questions in these units. So you'll see it's really an inclusive process involving teachers and administrators and staff throughout the region. The questions in 8th grade are, how do words unite or divide us? I'll share an example of that in a second, what that would look like if you were teaching in the classroom. Do zip codes matter? In 11th grade, you have, do all children in Monroe County receive an equitable education? And then the last is, how do historical housing practices impact the way people live today? And that's the unit that Kevin spoke to earlier. You also have the framing of this. We look at the historical issue or event that took place. I'll just read the first one there. The current issue that sparked, how it's the skills and practices that students should be able to do. You'll see here it is gathering and using and interpreting evidence. And then we do this connecting from past to present. It's really important that context, that students have context and content as they're processing this. So this inquiry at grade 8 begins the analysis of what happened in July 1964. We'll let up to that. And then how will they record it? How did people contextualize the events? Because words matter. And then we look at a current issue at the time was Daniel Prude's death, and how was that recorded and shared across the board? We then move into the stages of inquiry, and we look at words. So did some people call it a riot, uprising, or protest? What does each of those words mean, and how do they shape the reader or the person experiencing the matter? And how does it shape their mindset around addressing and analyzing this complex issue? So the supporting question 1 was what happened in Rochester on July 24th, 1964. You imagine they're reading newspaper articles and historical facts. They did some research in the public library, and they're pulling up all this history in Rochester, which again impacts the entire county, because there are people who were alive in the city during this time and moved out to the suburbs, which also led to, middle-class flight, arguably. Supporting question number 2, how do words shape the story, what happened in Rochester? And then the third question we do, how do words shape the story of what happened in Rochester, New York? As we were creating this, the same thing on a national level, this is when the Capitol was stormed. And so we were able to take a more current event and said, how did the Capitol event, events at the Capitol, how was that framed nationally through the media? And how did those words shape how people experience what happened in DC? We move forward and we look at having kids just take the headlines from those papers. And each of these represent headlines that were used nationally in the Democrat and Chronicle, online. And just wondered, are these words neutral? Were they negative? Were they positive? And how did those words help shape your mindset as you read the article? Again, we're not moving kids towards a single path of inquiry. We're making them aware that words often are used to convey a certain message and to appeal to a certain type of reader. And so we want to make sure the kids understand that, so they can be critical readers and thinkers. And then we continue this process for each of the units. And we're at the point now, as Kevin shared, to start to pilot these units last spring. And this school year is the first year where it's expected that all teachers across the county in grades 8 and 11 will support this. We provided training over the summer. We provided training all last year. And then the school districts are now responsible for continuing that training internally and supporting and getting support from those planning team members. Now, in some districts, I'll be honest, and I said I would share this, some districts are like already, fully ahead of us. Kevin and Mary represent 2 districts so we're not going to touch the units, we're not going to modify them, we're going to do them as is, see how the kids respond, and then we can modify after. Some districts may choose not to implement them. They may decide, you know what, this is not something we're ready for just yet, we're going to take more time. I highly discourage that, because I think you have to, every time we try to delay progress doesn't happen. And then there are those who may decide, you know what, I have an issue with this unit, so I'm going to pull this part of the curriculum out. And we're saying that teachers don't do that. The minute that we start to edit and filter the language, we start to move our kids to a single path of inquiry. And quite frankly, it's a single path of inquiry that we most believe in. And so we have to make sure that we present the information as is, allow kids to ask thoughtful questions, and then train teachers to be facilitators of conversation and not have the teacher be the center of knowledge. So that, they're giving the kids what they think the kids should know. We're allowing kids to think by putting their minds in the work and allow them to come up with their own stream of consciousness and their own way of thinking. And that is the units. Those are the units, and each of those units have that level of detail. But I wanted to just take one today and share with this group so you can better understand how we're trying to frame the discussion for our students and our staff.
Perfect, thank you. So I want to move into a little bit about outcomes. Superintendent Grow, let me start with you. Can you talk about the early outcomes you anticipate with the new curriculum?
Sure, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I think as Shaun so eloquently placed it, it's really about honoring exactly how these units are written. And we had the advantage in Eastern Irondequoit, as I mentioned last spring, to pilot one of the units. So we piloted the 8th grade unit. And we definitely saw a higher level of engagement from our students, even though our classroom makeup looked slightly different due to the pandemic and we had half the kids in person and half the kids remote. It really lent itself to a lot of great conversations. And I think what our students, because they were thinking so critically, it led to a lot of questioning. And they saw a lot of parallels between what was happening in 1964 to what was happening in the spring of 2020. And as a result of the death of George Floyd and Daniel Prude here locally. And so again, it's that idea of our students are really thinking critically by being presented with information, coming to their own conclusions and questioning. And so it's led to a lot of great conversation in the classroom. I think we anticipate as our students, again, at the higher levels in 11th and 12th grade, having those units rolling out at the upper grades, I think we're going to have even more levels of questioning as our students are now becoming voters and are really going to be able to take action if that's the course they choose. So we're really excited about what this is opening up to our students in terms of teaching and learning.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Dr. McGowan and Dr. Nelms, would you like to add anything to that?
I would just simply say first that the notion that our kids are able to make real connections to what is real and authentic and happening right here in Rochester was so powerful. You know, if you think about anybody here who can kind of transport themselves back to their own high school or middle school experience, this notion of, well, how does this really affect me anyways? When am I going to need to know this? Why is this important to me? Are these kinds of questions that adolescents and young people might have somewhere in the back of their mind? Well, this was real. This was happening right in front of them. And it really was, I think, so powerful for kids to gain a better understanding of why we are living in such a highly segregated area by digging into this study, essentially figuring out we created this. This was intentional. The way that this was formed over time, the covenants, the housing policies, the redlining that occurred, created the situation that we're in now, which had all these other outcomes along the way and that we're still dealing with today. So really a very hands-on understanding of that. And frankly, it was just another step in aligning learning for our students across their entire K-12 journey. Hopefully, then they will have a continued interest in digging further into what has happened in the past, and then what policies currently exist that continue to impact racism and disparities for people in our area.
No, I have nothing more to add. I think Mary and Kevin said it perfectly. And I would add this, is that I think for a long time, we as adults were somewhat, you know, we live within communities, we stay within those communities, our friends were within those communities, and that's where we function and played. Our students are completely different. I mean, they are so engaged and connected through social media with students all over the region. Something happens at East, kids in Brighton are talking about it with kids at East, kids at Victor are talking about it with kids in Brighton. I mean, the kids are connected. And so it's sad that we have school systems that honestly are created to keep our kids segregated and isolated and insular. Yet our kids' world is more connected and diverse and inclusive. And so the school system has to catch up. And this gives us a unique opportunity to have all of our students. I mean, imagine the class of 2022 having every kid who's a senior next year graduating, having a different context and construct for learning as they exit our high schools as a region. If we're talking about economic development and regional development, it starts with having an informed community. And to be honest, as adults, we messed it up. We did not do a good job of creating an inclusive Rochester. And so it's up to our children now and our future students to do that if we want to have a viable Rochester region. And I believe our curriculum could be the key to that, and making sure that our students see themselves reflected in the curriculum, but more importantly, they see their classmates and neighbors and colleagues reflected in that work as well. You know, when we first started this, there was someone who, you know, I got a lot of emails. There was one person who really wrote this scathing email saying that, well, why are we teaching about, you know, Black issues in predominantly white communities? And I almost did not respond, because I typically don't. But this time I did. And I said, you know, this is as important for Black youth as it is for white youth and brown youth, because they have to go into a space at some point where they may not be the majority person in that room or the majority mindset or the majority way of thinking. And so it was shame on us if we have a kid leaving high school to go to college, and they make a career decision comment. We've seen this now in the NFL. They make decisions that come back to haunt them because they didn't know any better, or they knew better and chose not to stand up, or they knew better and chose not to respond appropriately. As educators, if we're not preparing kids for those moments, then I don't know what the heck we're doing. And so I applaud Mary and I applaud Kevin for their effort in leading it within their district, but I also applaud the other 18 superintendents in our region who are committed to doing the same. My ask of folks on this panel and those who are listening is support the superintendents who are making the tough decisions. You know, when issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism becomes an issue in communities, it becomes a very fragmented space. And sometimes superintendents are left out on their own. And some superintendents will lean in and say, we're going to be honest about the ugliness in our community. We're going to address it head on. Mary and Kevin do that well. They do it often. And there are others who may have a hard time doing that because they're not certain. This is if by taking on this challenge, is that a career ending decision? I think now is the time for school communities to demand of superintendents to take on the challenges, and for superintendents to do the things that are morally and ethically right, regardless if it causes them their jobs or not. Because if you live right and you do right, there's going to be another district that's going to pick you up. And so I'm asking and begging for those on this call to lean into your school boards, lean into your towns leaders, lean into your superintendents, and give them the green light to take on the hard and honest conversations that are impeding our children from living productive and inclusive lives.
Absolutely. Thank you for that and for adding those nuances to the conversation. And I think that transitions us well to the next question, which speaks to barriers. So Dr. McGowan, can you talk about any barriers you expect to confront in implementing the new curriculum and how we can overcome them?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas. And I'd like to just start by thanking Shaun for his leadership, his courage and leadership, and his kind words and his words of support, and his call out to everyone to support the work and to support the leaders who are making those difficult decisions, because he brings up, I think, an important point. And it's beyond just Monroe County. This is across the state. And Shaun and Mary both know, because we talk about these things on a statewide level, the hazards that people are experiencing in taking on such important issues. And frankly, they absolutely have to happen. To that point, I like how Shaun said that school systems really need to catch up. Kids are way down the road on this, right? They are far past where most of the adults are. And I think, to be very specific in answering your question, what are the barriers? The barriers really revolve around the divisiveness that we are experiencing in society, the polarization, the acceptability of being hateful. Those, I think, are some of the biggest barriers. There are others to consider. One is just simply the training required, the professional development, the moving systems. We have lots and lots of staff members in our districts, and it would seem to many people on the outside that it is simple to put things into place and say, okay, let's go and we'll do this, and this should happen. It's very complicated to move systems in different directions, especially directions that are really challenging for people to wrap their head around. So providing a safe place for educators to move in that direction, to protect them in the same ways that Shaun is mentioning, protecting your leaders, to put them in positions where they can be successful. There's a lot of hesitancy for educators, feeling as though if they say the wrong thing or they approach this in the wrong way, they'll be the victim on social media of a campaign to call them out for being hateful, when in fact they're trying to do good work in many cases. So there's this uncomfortableness, this anxiety. When we talk about issues of race, this is so personal for so many. And I recognize that some people might interpret this as maybe going down a path of white fragility. I don't mean it in that way at all. I mean that there are people that would like to do good work that are in vulnerable, risky positions, and we need to support them and make that a space where they can really take risks comfortably in pushing people in the most uncomfortable conversations. And again, it's very personal. It calls into question a lot of our notions and a lot of the the curriculum that we grew up with and the experiences that we grew up with as educators. And so I think that kind of support is awfully important. It's having enough resources, time, and space to provide training for people. But then let me just go back to, again, the biggest barrier and call it out for what it is. The biggest barrier is the pushback from people in communities in many places where there's this conversation that's been created by one segment, I think, that has completely polarized this discussion. You know, for example, just simply over the summer, as this evolved, the questions about critical race theory and using that as, I think, an overarching term to say, why are you talking about race in school? And I heard this from people directly. Why are you making my child feel guilty for being white? And that's not what this is. This is owning our past practices, our past policies, our experiences, the things that have happened in the past that have led to where we are today, and being upfront and honest about that and engaging in experience to learn from that so we can improve things going forward. And we have to call that out, and we have to have the courage and the support to move that ball forward down the field, and again, really to look at this as an opportunity to learn and grow. But I do think that that's likely the biggest obstacle, and that's why, as Shaun mentioned, different ways of different approaches to implementation have happened. So those that have jumped all in, those that have modified, or those that have modified significantly or tapped the brakes a bit, likely has to do with these issues. So the more we can push forward with that in the most uncomfortable spaces, the more progress we're likely to make.
Absolutely. Thank you for that contribution. I want to give space for Dr. Nelms and Superintendent Grow to add anything at this time.
Yeah, I think Kevin did an excellent job of summing that up. You know, in terms of a barrier, I think, as Kevin so well put it, I think there's that apprehension sometimes with teachers being so fearful that they will say the wrong thing or deliver the wrong message. And I think as we've been doing this work, we've learned we have to support our teachers. We have to give them spaces. We have to really invest in professional development for our teaching staff so that they are prepared for the conversations, so that they create a welcoming, open community in their classroom to have these difficult conversations. I also think that, again, one of the barriers as we're doing this work is sometimes people feel like they can allow for opt-outs because the topics are uncomfortable. And I think it's really important that we don't opt out of this and that we don't create an option to opt out. We have to commit to this work. I personally feel like it's a moral obligation of ours as educators to do this work on behalf of our students. And so, again, supporting our folks who are in the classrooms, who are doing the teaching, supporting our administrators as they're leading the work as well in their buildings, so that they are enabled and they are supported to do the work and to have the tough conversations.
I think the only thing I would add to that is making sure that we acknowledge and give some space and some grace for teachers who, may not be familiar with some of these topics, may be uncomfortable with some of these topics, may even have political views that suggest they don't want to talk about these topics, and to say to them, it's your job to facilitate the conversation. And so we put a lot of energy and emphasis in the curriculum itself. So if you are someone who's uncomfortable, go by the script. Just do what's in front of you, facilitate the conversation, and don't go off script. If you're someone who has a deeper knowledge of some of the topics, go right ahead. But you are serving as a facilitator, not the person who's all-knowing. And that's what an inquiry is all about, is acknowledging that there are differing perspectives and views, and to create safe space for kids to have that dialogue in discourse. And so the type of training that we've had, I think that was a question I saw in the chat, is we intentionally chose, or superintendents chose, individuals to come be part of the lesson in development, so they can go back and be the resident experts, if you will, around the creation of those units. It was intentional from the university's perspective that we didn't create it and give it to districts, that it had to be co-constructed. And through that process, we realized that teachers did have a lot of gaps in their learning and knowledge, but we created safe spaces for them also. So I would say one of the challenges or opportunities or obstacles may be districts not providing safe space for teachers to be open and honest about their discomfort in some of these units, but also giving that same space for people who are comfortable and allowing them to take the lead and in support of their colleagues. And so that definitely is an obstacle that we have to face. I also want to say that these units are not the cure of racism. The history is deep, and I'm sure there are very, 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 very there are more appropriate topics that could be used to illustrate this point. We chose to start here. And the idea is that as we become more comfortable, as we become more knowledgeable about these topics, we'll expand these units over time. But for now, we want to get through this year, look at grades 8 and 11. That's where US history is taught. And it's also part of the state standards, and see how students and staff respond. And then we will adjust accordingly. But a huge obstacle is making sure that we don't assume that teachers have the knowledge and skills to do this, that we give them space and resources and time to be able to do this work effectively.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Dr. Nelms, continuing with you, can you talk about your vision for the future of this curriculum, what it means for new ways of educating our young people about our past, and the impact it can have on our understanding of Rochester's deep, long-standing history of segregation and disparity?
Yeah, I spoke to that already, so I'll give Mary and Kevin an opportunity to speak to that as well. My vision was to get it started. And my vision was to engage my colleagues, superintendent colleagues who I know. Well, before these incidents, we've been talking about how to do some of this work. Again, we started with Rock to Change, but that really impacted a very few number of students. When you look at something to this scale, where we're ensuring that all kids, grades 8 and 11, receive these units, that's the vision I had. I didn't want it to be teacher dependent. I didn't want it to be district dependent. I didn't want it to be superintendent dependent. I didn't want it to be political environment dependent. It wanted to be, if we put it into the curriculum and we impact teaching and learning and assessment, then we can ensure that all of our students leave with a different context and construct and a different way of thinking. And so that was my vision. And at this point, I have no way of guaranteeing that this is going to happen in every school district, nor do I want that responsibility. I just think that I'm just fortunate to have some incredible colleagues, again, it's about 20 of us in this region who are committed to this work. And I hope that every superintendent has the same level of commitment as folks like Kevin and Mary have moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Kevin and Mary, do either of you have anything that you want to add as far as visions are concerned?
After you, Mary.
Thanks, Kevin. I think Shaun summed it up very nicely. Again, I think it's a portion of the larger work that we need to continue to do. And I think the beauty of these units is that, again, this is about educating our students about the city that they're living in and the history that has impacted and shaped the city that we all call home. And I hope that they take that learning and they carry it on when they leave Rochester, whether it's to go to college or maybe move away, but they understand how that history has shaped Rochester and part of who they are.
So if we go all the way back to the beginning, Shaun mentioned something about us all being on the same page, and largely that ends up being with regard to athletic events. And I think that's a great point. We have 20 very different school districts. We have a hard time necessarily coming together even on whether or not we'll have school on a snow day, as many of the audience members would know when they look at how that changes for different people. Yet this was a topic that people, to a person, said this has to happen. This is important work. Now, yes, implementations in all different places, as Shaun mentioned, for a lot of different reasons, I think. But it is remarkable that this was such a united effort to say, yes, this work absolutely needs to happen. A lot of our work around diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism work ends up being reactive. That don't use those words, don't say that, who did what to whom and how did they do it and how do we overcome that? How do we teach kids to be more inclusive and kind to each other? And that's important work. However, the long-term, the bigger picture perspective as educators, as teachers, really requires us to think deeply about what children are being taught, how they're being taught, what materials in front of them, and what will help them ask better questions going forward about the world that they live in, about the societal norms that we have, about the policies and the practices that have gotten us to this place, but that they as future leaders can help correct so that we're in a better place for the long term. And so this was, I think, such an important project in really digging deeper beyond policies and practices in districts and discipline issues and the other work that is important relative to equity and inclusivity. But this work really moves the needle in a very different and very authentic way that I think is essential.
All right, thank you for that. At this point, we're going to start taking some questions from the chat. I want to express my appreciations in advance for your patience if time does not permit us to get to all of the questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. So starting with the first one I see in the chat from Sharon Silvio, I would love to know if the superintendents have had requests from parents to ban certain books from being read in classrooms and to remove them from libraries.
I don't mean to jump in front of my colleagues, but I will just say we have had over time different discussions around texts that were uncomfortable for some families and worked through each of those. Some were more public or less public. I think that's probably something that most districts experience all the time throughout history, not just relative to race and equity conversations, but maturity level, issues relative to texts that are about LGBTQ issues or sexual situations, in particular novels. Those kinds of objections are not uncommon for us to face, actually, relative to texts. And those things do come up, yes.
Thank you for that.
Thomas, can I was sort of Mary's going to jump in. I just want to add that I think banning the books is those are the most extreme cases. What I'm hearing is how are books being contextualized for students? So when you take a book like we take a book that To Kill a Mockingbird, for example. That's a book that always comes up every year. Every district has a To Kill a Mockingbird moment. And it's not that the book itself is a bad book. It's that there are other books that can be used to tell the Black story, and often by Black or brown artists. And so maybe you take two different books and you talk about how authors who represent certain communities display or represent those communities in text. And so it's more of a comparison text, right? Maybe you take certain passages from certain books and compare and contrast how the author uses characterization to illustrate how to survive or how to overcome obstacles. I think what has happened is that we teach the same books we were taught. And other books are never introduced. And we worked really hard to do that at East and across the county, but I can speak for East on this one. We revamped our entire curriculum in a way that hopefully is more inclusive of our students. We do know that because of that, when we ask students what was the difference in their academic success over the last few years, they talk about being seen and being heard. And I'll put in the chat a website, Elevated Educator, that you can kind of go in and see how some of those units look and feel for the student and the staff. But again, I mean, the book conversation is kind of at the end of the story. The curriculum that we control as superintendents is what happens in the middle. The creation of the curriculum, the identification of the books and text, how the conversations are going to be had, that's the instructional piece. Then how do we assess if students truly understand the meaning of that particular text? And so no single book can do all of that. So you have multiple perspectives, and part of our job is to make sure that teachers are aware of those books. So we expand the libraries, not getting rid of books. And I think that's been our effort as well across the region. But I'll put some information in the chat for people to look at if they choose.
Thank you. Superintendent Grow, would you like to contribute to this question?
Sure, I just would, go along with exactly what Shaun and Kevin were saying. I think that, again, we've made a commitment in East Irondequoit to really select materials and resources that have multiple perspectives, and being very conscientious of putting materials in front of our students that are truly reflecting our student body. Sometimes people, again, may have comments or opinions about certain texts, but in terms of outright banning books and things of that nature, again, we really are looking at expanding the amount of resources for all of our students.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wanna give a reminder that we only have about 4 minutes left in this session. There is one more question that I think we might have time for, and it's about feedback from students. And essentially, what has the feedback from students been like? Are they appreciating the content? Are they pushing, are you seeing an increase in interest? Things of that nature.
I'll just say very, very briefly in the interest of time, our kids were very excited about it. They enjoyed the work. They were inspired by it. They dug pretty far in and were engaged and had nothing but positive feedback about the work that they were engaged in. And yes, I think they developed a greater sense of curiosity moving forward to think about inquiry in a different way and what else they should be looking at, similar to housing policies.
And I'll just echo what Kevin said. As I had mentioned, we piloted the 8th grade unit last spring. And again, we saw a higher level of engagement with student conversations or classroom conversations. I think one of the big takeaways, as I might have mentioned earlier, was that I think a lot of our students came to the realization that a lot hasn't changed from 1964 into modern day. And I think that caught a lot of them by surprise in terms of history repeating itself. And so again, led to some rich conversations that carried out of this unit into the teaching of history throughout the entire 8th grade course. So it was pretty awesome for kids to make those connections and to be looking at it through that lens.
The comment that I heard really was from the adults. They were surprised at how much the kids actually knew and how much they have seen and observed nationally. And so I think it was an opportunity for adults to, again, to understand that the students' level of inquiry might be a little bit more advanced than our own. And that if we're going to really have these conversations, they have to have the skills and tools and techniques to really facilitate those meaningfully, because kids are watching and reading sometimes misinformation, but they're coming to the table with information, and to help them kind of discern between what's fact and fiction and what they need to go and be more curious about. I love Kevin's use of the term curiosity, how to become more curious about what they're reading to ensure that they have a balanced perspective also. And we know that the adults have not done a good job of that. I mean, if you look at how Facebook, the algorithm is set on our single path of inquiry. And so they only give you ideas and information around things that you have interest in your single way of thinking about it. We're asking kids to not become a consumer of like-minded information like many of the adults have been over the last few years.
All right, thank you for that. So I want to give many thanks to you, Dr. Nelms, Dr. McGowan, and Superintendent Groh for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to those of you who attended today's session. Please be sure to complete the survey that you received at the end of today's event to give us feedback, and keep an eye out for further resources on this and other topics. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.